Greetings. I'm Joanne Bougalis, speaking on behalf of myself and my mother, Katherine Bougalis. I want to thank the Australian Association to Stop Guardianship and Administration Abuse for inviting me to tell our story. My mother was a ward under guardianship in Minnesota in the United States until we escaped to Greece in 2016. My parents were married for 50 years when my father passed away in 2010. They immigrated to America from Greece, seeking a better life after the substantial losses their families endured during the war. They were products of an arranged marriage, and both worked long hours to succeed, not only to gain financial security, but to gain each other's admiration. Theirs is the typical American success story, coming to America with nothing, not even the English language skills, and working hard to amass a safety net for their family. My father arrived in America at 18 years old with no money in his pocket, developed a successful construction business, and built his last building at 78 years old. My mother arrived at 19 years old and earned 4 college degrees. She worked 2 full-time jobs simultaneously as both a medical surgical nurse and a nursing instructor. My parents' primary goal was to be financially safe in their old age and to pass on to their 4 children the family legacy that their parents had lost during the war. Between the 2 of them, they contributed 90 productive years to the American economy. And my mother, who now receives no financial benefit whatsoever from her and my father's stolen estate, and had to escape America for her freedom, is forced to continue to donate her hard-earned money to a human trafficking ring of white-collar criminals, and she's forced to continue to contribute approximately $300,000 a year in taxes to the American government, even 6 years after escaping the country that still refuses to protect her. These are real human beings whose lives and life's work is allowed to be stolen from them by the very government that invited them to their country to contribute to the economy. The U.S. government is well aware of the problem in guardianship, yet the financial benefit to them is so great that they continually turn a blind eye to victims. I'd like to share a story of how my mother was targeted, how her rights were taken away, and how she and I were treated in guardianship, and the steps we took to seek justice. I'll share why we had to escape, how we escaped, and how our life has been since. Our story is based on documented facts. My opinions in this commentary are based on my personal experience and the experiences of other victims I've come into contact with. Guardianship not only steals the identity and the quality of life of the family member targeted as the ward, it affects the entire family financially and otherwise. If my mother had been murdered by the choices of a judge and a guardian, I would be left living with the physical and psychological health effects and consequences, as unfortunately so many family members are. Because in most situations, guardianship is set up for escape to be impossible. Guardianship is unfamiliar to most people. Even professionals who work in the helping fields believe it's a good thing. Guardians and judges often take advantage of this belief that guardianship will provide justice, when in fact, many guardianships are set up by white-collar criminals posing as professionals to commit identity theft under the color of law. Guardianship in itself is not a bad concept, but it's become an avenue for racketeering. As Dr. Sam Sugar, the founder of Americans Against Abusive Probate Guardianship, stated in his book, guardianship is the perfect crime. Fraudulent guardianships are often based on false narratives to meet the goals of predatory white-collar criminals. In the United States, statistics show that 5,000 out of every 100,000 people get arrested for white-collar crime annually, but only 3% get prosecuted. That's because white-collar criminals benefit from the institutionalized non-enforcement practices and legal representation that's not available to others. Guardianship is often misused to provide income for those that are appointed to manage the ward, and to support various agencies such as county social services and assisted living facilities. Private guardians, such as in my mother's case, purposely choose wealthy clients to feed on. Professional guardians in the United States, unlike any other helping profession, don't have a licensing requirement. Judges have absolute immunity with the right to violate civil liberties without fear of being held liable. That combination is an invitation for the perfect crime. One attorney who reviewed our case said, "There are a lot of fishy things in this case. Unusual things happen in guardianship, and the average citizen has no idea the human trafficking they can be forced into. It's a gravy train based on deceit and chaos, from beginning to end." Oftentimes, a sense of self-entitlement leads to an unwarranted guardianship. My mother was targeted after my father died because my two younger brothers were relentless in their efforts to isolate her to get control of her assets. No matter what we did, they were right around the corner, working to take and keep control any way they could. Not knowing anything about guardianship, I trusted the advice of a colleague and sought to protect my mother with an emergency guardianship. As my two brothers fought the guardianship, I realized that my own attorneys were not looking out for my or my mother's best interests. Before the court hearing for permanent guardianship, in which I requested to be co-guardian with a professional guardian to provide protections, my attorney at the last minute changed the paperwork that we had agreed on. He purposely placed me under duress to sign that I should not be co-guardian because he said it would make me look like I'm after my mother's money. I disagreed, but he said there was no time to change the paperwork. He stated I had to sign because the documents were due to the court in 10 minutes, and if we don't turn them in, we would lose the case completely. That gave the judge the opportunity to appoint my brother's 70-year-old widowed mother-in-law, which allowed my brother to maintain control. As I sought to protect my mother, I became the target of slander and had orders for protection against me to keep my mother isolated from me, to disempower her, and to disempower my ability to help her. My mother lived her life in fear in an environment surrounded by threats, physical violence, and gaslighting. The treatment she received resulted in a traumatic brain injury. The next attorney I hired convinced me, using duress and gaslighting, to sign away my rights as beneficiary of my mother's trust. The night before signing, the attorney tried to convince me to sign away my rights. He told me, "You said you don't care about the money." Something sure felt fishy. The next morning, I told him I wasn't willing to sign over my right as beneficiary because it's not an appropriate request. He told me, "I'm doubting your stability changing your mind overnight." He then took my computer in his hand and said, "If you don't sign, your brother's attorney requested I turn over your computer for a forensics check, and that will cost your mother's estate $8,000. I requested to consult my older brother, and the attorney told me that if I talked to him, that would eliminate our attorney-client privilege. He pressured me to sign during the meeting by threatening that if I don't sign, he could no longer represent me. I knew he was gaslighting me, but I felt trapped. I realized in that moment that this attorney charged me $50,000 in 3 weeks, only to place me and my mother on the losing end. With the idea that this hell could perpetuate, I gave in so that my mother could have some peace and not be involved in the courts, with the hope that I could still save her. My mother ended up free of guardianship, but not for long. During the next 6 months, my two brothers took unprecedented steps to legally eliminate me from the family trust and manipulate documents in their favor, while leaving my mother in a state of complete despair. She was afraid to call me because she thought that my brothers might hurt me if she did. I was afraid to contact her for fear that they would hurt her for communicating with me. In her isolated state, she was coerced to sign more papers, until 6 months later, when she became so desperate for help, she took the risk to seek me out. She and I chose to leave Minnesota and start a life together in Arizona. That was the beginning of the end, because predators seek prey wherever they are. Once settled in Arizona, my mother sought out a trust attorney to rewrite her trust to regain control of her assets that my brother had taken over. We had no idea at the time that this attorney would take steps not to protect her, but to enrich himself and ultimately force her into guardianship. The steps he took and the advice he gave was by no means in my mother's best interest, but we made the mistake of trusting him. When he rewrote my mother's trust, he sent a copy to my brother in Minnesota, which is unprecedented, and my brother immediately asked the court to freeze her assets, thus starting a costly and lucrative legal process. Had he looked out for my mother, he would have advised her to remain in Arizona out of the jurisdiction of Minnesota. But he was after the money, and the money was in Minnesota. Within 11 months, this attorney wrote her trust, became her trustee, and then forced her into guardianship by finding a doctor to upgrade her diagnosis from mild cognitive impairment to severe dementia. The week after my mother was forced into permanent guardianship, her attorney made enough money to announce the opening of his own law firm. Although it seems unrealistic that so many attorneys could be corrupt, many attorneys become enticed by the financial opportunity in the guardianship racket to make large amounts of money, while others choose to side with the guardians for their own safety, as several have been disbarred for opposing guardianships. In Minnesota, for the second time, an emergency guardianship took place. The cards were in the hands of the professional players, and there was no way to stop them. 2 months later, at the hearing for permanent guardianship, my mother was ready to fight for her rights. And she was ready to fight for her rights and her freedom, but she was denied the right to be present in court. The emergency guardian forced her to go to a routine doctor appointment at the exact hour of the hearing, so she couldn't defend herself. Without her participation or knowledge, her identity was stolen with a stroke of a judge's pen. The day he was appointed, the guardian arrogantly told me, "I am now your mother." In the United States, the guardian's typical method of operation is to place wards in a facility within the first 3 months of guardianship. Before we escaped, my mother was institutionalized for 1.5 years. I couldn't visit her except when I was scheduled to visit. During that time, her health declined, and I would often find her in her room in the fetal position, in complete despair. She would say, "Why did my children do this to me? If this is my life, I want to die." She begged me to help her, and I promised her we would seek justice through the courts, and if that failed, I would find a way to free her. Believing in the justice system, my mother said, "The judge will understand if I tell him what's happening to me. Just get me in front of him, and I'll tell him." I requested a hearing asking the court that my mother be allowed further medical testing for her dementia diagnosis and to live with me or to live in her own home with assistance. The judge denied my mother the right to testify because he said she was legally incapacitated, a label he had given her without medical testing for a proper diagnosis. In court, none of the professionals were able to testify to the type of dementia my mother purportedly had. The obstetrics doctor, who diagnosed her with severe dementia, testified that no further testing was needed because, in her opinion, the only outcome for dementia was further decline. Despite convincing testimony of family and friends, the judge did not request further medical testing. He decided that my mother would remain locked in a facility and determined that I was unwilling to work with the professionals. Nothing changed. After the hearing, my mother's disappointment was beyond consolable. I would take her out of the facility for 2 hours, the 2 hours that I was allowed, and she would call the police, refusing to re-enter the facility. She insisted that she did nothing wrong, and it's her sons that should be locked up, not her. By the 3rd call to the police, she was told that they cannot help her because it was a civil case, not criminal. According to an investigator, the guardian then placed my mother on a drug combination that would render her unconscious. At that point, the guardian made it clear that I would no longer see my mother and that she would be moved to an undisclosed location. His justification was that my presence was upsetting her ability to acclimate to being locked in the institution, to having her life extinguished, to being thrown away. We would never see each other again. I couldn't let that happen. I promised her freedom, and I wasn't going to let her down. When someone else took her for a visit outside of the facility, I seized the opportunity to take her out of the state and out of the jurisdiction. My mother and I left the state with only one suitcase, $300, and our driver's license. Despite missing persons bulletins, with the help of family, friends, and my military comrades, we hid across the country for 2 months. In retaliation, the guardian canceled my mother's credit card and spent more of her funds to become her guardian in Arizona as well. He entered our Arizona home, destroyed our property, while police officers watched helplessly, stating yet again that the guardianship is a civil matter. I contacted the Greek embassy by phone to see if there was any way they could help. The embassy representative said, because we had dual citizenship, she could get us an emergency passport the following day. After arriving in Greece, contrary to the U.S. obstetric doctor's diagnosis of severe dementia, my mother was tested by both a psychologist and a neurologist who diagnosed her with mild cognitive impairment and severe trauma. With medical assistance, her traumatic brain injury healed completely. My mother and I have lived happily together in Greece for the past 6 years. She enjoys her life living with her sister, living as a free citizen, and making choices for herself while visiting family and friends. The guardian continues the false narrative even today, pretending that he hasn't been notified of the location of this ward. He continues to submit annual reports stating her location is unknown, thereby continuing to charge her estate for fees, including his annual income, attorney and accounting fees, medical bills that have no merit without a ward, and unexplained miscellaneous fees. The court continues to allow guardianship to exist without a ward in their jurisdiction and continues to approve the guardian's accounting, providing no financial support for my mother whatsoever. Had it not been for the American Embassy in Greece helping my mother redirect her Social Security benefits, my mother, whose estate is worth an estimated $6 million, would be left completely destitute by the guardian. In retaliation for daring to get her rightful freedom, I hope our story can help prevent victimization or help someone in their own journey for justice. Thank you for your time.